and welcome again to A Look into History. I am your host, Dave Buckley, and today we will be discussing the relationship between U.S. foreign policy and Cuban immigration as a result of the Cold War through the 1960s onwards. Our first guest is a Rhodes Scholar, accredited historian, Dr. Steve Jones. He is the leading expert on U.S. foreign policy development and wrote Coming from Cuba, Analysis of the Development of Foreign Policy Regarding the Cuban Revolution. Steve, thank you for making it all the way from Washington. Could you please explain to the viewers what created the tension between the U.S. and Cuba?
Thank you, Dave. As some of you may know, the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. was not always as bitter as it became during the late 20th century. In fact, the U.S. assisted in Cuba's fight for independence against Spain in 1898, if only to get Cuba under U.S. control. The U.S. continually intervened with its military, off and on, throughout the early 20th century, until it found a leader to back, Fulgencio Batista, who supported U.S. intervention in the area. This era of domination was kickstarted by a military coup organized by the U.S. and eventually ended in revolution led by Fidel Castro in 1959. This is when relations between the U.S. and Cuba became tense and we began to see a shift in the policies toward each other. Cuba began to shift its privatized industries such as sugar, oil, and banking towards a nationalized model. As they continued to do this, the U.S. began restricting trade with Cuba, and this led to Cuba trading with the communist Soviet Union. This angered the U.S. because, as you know, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were involved in the Cold War during that period.
Now, Steve, along with the trade restrictions, what else did the U.S. do to influence Cuban development?
Well, the U.S. took thousands of Cuban exiles and began to trade them in guerrilla warfare in U.S. facilities to start the invasion known as the Bay of Pigs. From this, we can see that the animosity between these two nations allowed for a group of immigrants to become part of a U.S. strategy to overthrow Castro for their own interests. Without the support of the Soviet Union, the U.S. would have destroyed Cuban economically with its trade restrictions. But with the Soviet Union support, the U.S. had to find other means to gain influence over Cuba as it once had during the Batista era.
Steve, what were the repercussions of trading with the Soviet Union?
Well, Cuba was very dependent upon the Soviet Union for its food and military aid. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1994, their economy suffered immensely. Their overall GPA dropped 34%, with export and imports decreasing 80%. There was major food shortages, electricity shortages, and gas shortages, and Castro responded by rationing these goods. Castro forbade travel between the U.S. and Cuba, but since these were such hard times, many Cubans were looking for political freedom and economic opportunity. So a lot of them fled in boats and other water transportation to the U.S. to seek freedom. This was a period of a large wave of immigrants where the U.S. saw around 33,000 immigrants looking to enter the country.
Telling me is that the tension between the U.S. and Cuba came from Cubans' association with the Soviet Union?
Well, yes and no. You see, Dave, this situation was not created by the trading between Cuba and the Soviet Union, but it did add fuel to the fire. As I previously stated, the situation arose from the U.S. imperial tendencies, which was a core belief of their foreign policy stemming from the 19th century. Cuba's unwillingness to continue this trend under Castro, along with their association with the Soviet Union, their communist ideologies, and their anti-U.S. statements, led to this current situation. All of these factors combined to many Cubans fleeing the country and the U.S. accepting them with open arms.
How were the immigration policies affected between the U.S. and Cuba?
Well, because of the political tension between the U.S. and Cuba at that time, all immigrants were accepted as political refugees. This policy was continued up until the 1980s, until around 1990, where they tightened the U.S. immigration policies for immigrants. However, Cubans received a different treatment than other immigrants with the creation of the wet feet, dry feet policy. It allowed them to remain in the U.S. if they reached land as a form of asylum, while other immigrants would be sent back. This created tension between Cubans and other immigrants within communities in South Florida and other areas, and really changed the dynamic between the Cuban immigrants and other immigrants in their communities.
Dr. Steve, we'd like to thank you for stopping by today and giving us a good insight on the history of Cuba and the United States of America. Remember, folks, to check out his book, Coming from Cuba. It is in stores now. We would now like to welcome Maria Gutierrez-Manoya, who is the daughter of Eloy Gutierrez-Manoya, who just recently passed away. Here's a quick clip of why he is so special in Cuban American society.
Former Cuban revolutionary Eloy Gutierrez-Manoya, who later became a dissident, has died at the age of 77. Gutierrez-Manoya was a commander during the 1959 Cuban Revolution, but after losing faith in the communist leadership, went on to lead an uprising against Castro and spent 22 years in prison.
Maria, thank you for joining us today. Now, can you explain to the viewers what made you first migrate to the U.S.?
Yeah, I migrated to the United States at the age of 7 in 1963 because Cuba was not the ideal living situation. My dad had already fled to the U.S. when he formed the Alpha 66, and when he came back to try to overthrow Castro, he told my mother and I that the U.S. was completely different than Cuba, and he wanted to protect us, so he suggested that we go to the U.S., and he promised to come back as soon as he finished his mission. I just didn't think it would take as long as it did. After he was released in 1986, he came back to live in Miami until 2003 when he moved to Cuba and he passed away this October.
Can you explain to us what type of people migrated to the United States and how they influenced the United States communities?
Mm-hmm. Most people who migrated to the United States were exiles. Like my father, they were well educated, they were high, middle, upper class, and they had some sort of political stance. They ultimately posed a threat to Castro. The exiles were considered freedom fighters in the United States, and we were all similar in the fact that we didn't think that the move to the United States was going to be permanent. We thought that we would live in the U.S. until the communism was over. But once we realized it was long-term, we began creating a community. We adapted to the American ways and became part of the American economy. The community expanded from about 40 people to over 300, and now it has restaurants, banks, shopping centers, and other real estate. A lot of Cubans already had the knowledge and experience so that they were capable of succeeding.
Maria, we have one last question for you today. How was your experience in the Miami community different from most other Cubans?
My father was viewed as some sort of hero, and because of this, I was more privileged than others. I was more well off, and my family and I lived comfortably. Whereas others weren't as wealthy and fortunate. It was more difficult for them to be accepted into American society.
Well, Maria, we would like to thank you for coming by today. We would also like to thank our other guest, Dr. Steve Jones, for coming by as well today, and as well our sponsor for our show, Pepsi. Folks, tune in next week as we welcome a Mayan priest to the show to discuss the 2012 apocalypse and how you should prepare yourself for the end of the world.